Hi, welcome back. In part one, I talked about Hamlet's Mill and how Hamlet's Mill, the authors of Hamlet's Mill, connect myth to the Great Precessional Cycle. And they say that myth contains key symbols, key stories, and key numbers that display and give information about the precessional cycle. I then talked about in the first part how these myths are also displayed in the Shakespeare play Hamlet, which is what they named their book after. And Hamlet is that story that contains some very interesting connections to Tycho Brahe. Tycho Brahe is the one whose model was the accepted model during that time. During the time when Shakespeare was performed was around 1600. And then after that, our model changed to the Copernicus system, even though Copernicus came up with his theory about 50 years before Tycho Brahe did. So this story of Hamlet uses a couple of Tycho Brahe's cousins, and they are the ones who tried to rat out Hamlet and cause his demise. Now, this is interesting because really the play, the story, the mythological story that it's based on, Enlil, is about precessional cycle. And in the Shakespeare version, Hamlet is not successful and it leads to his demise. And it's almost as though the play is trying to convey something so as to stop the turning of the ages. Okay, so, and of course, in all of that, there's this wonderful link with conspiracy and the idea, well, the truth that Tycho Brahe was murdered, and we wonder why he was murdered. Was it linked to this stumbling upon some key information about the precessional cycle? In that episode, I introduced the Tychos model, which is an updated version of Tycho Brahe's model. Tycho Brahe did not have a precessional, anything to account for precession in his model. However, he did talk about his estimate of amount of time that it took the stars to precess. So we know that he was considering it, though it never made it into any of his models as something that would depict the precessional cycle. Tycho Brahe's model was taken by Simon Schach, and Simon Schach added an orbit for Earth, and Earth's orbit is essentially the precessional cycle. In part two, I talk about this precessional cycle if Earth is going at this very slow pace through the universe and taking 25,344 years as the Tychos model claims, then in 2 points of that model, there would be times where Earth would pass through the Milky Way area or a dangerous area, and many people link it to the Milky Way, and this would be 2 periods of time when it passes through Gemini, which we are doing right now because our North Pole is pointed at Polaris, which is in Gemini, and it points, our spring equinox to Pisces. Now, this takes or shifts our perspective from looking at the ages as defined by what's on the equinox and focuses it instead on the pole star. What pole star is ruling over us? That was essentially part two. And I did get into a little bit about the mythologies that talk about this dangerous time, and they are linked to the story of Mars, Samson, and there is somewhat of a connection with Samson and also Saturn, because at the very end it says, and he judged for 20 years. This is the end of the biblical passage, and he dies and he judged for 20 years. So 20 is the number of years that is between a Saturn and Jupiter cycle. So today we are going to talk about the Saturn Jupiter cycle, and it's linked to the precessional age. So, the myth of Kronos and Zeus. So first it should be known that Kronos and Zeus are in the Greek pantheon, and Zeus is basically Jupiter. Jupiter is the Roman version, and Kronos is Saturn. Saturn is the Roman version. Now I'm going to talk in a minute about the Sumerian counterparts to those two, because it brings in an interesting element. But their stories, the Greek and the Roman versions, are very similar in that there is the Saturn or Kronos character, and he's king and he rules over a golden age. And in an attempt to ensure that he is always king, every time his wife Rhea has a child, he swallows the child so that there can never be an heir to take over and become ruler. Now, his wife is so sick and tired of him eating or swallowing his children that she takes the last one, which is Zeus, and she hides Zeus, giving Kronos, or the Saturn character, a large stone to swallow instead, and he doesn't notice. He swallows the stone. But eventually Zeus grows up and he battles with his father in basically a war between the Titans and the Olympians, and the Olympians take over and Zeus becomes king. So now we have a new era which is ruled over by Zeus, which is Jupiter, and he rules over an Iron Age. Now we know that the Iron Age is a descending age. It is the Dark Age. So this is very curious because in astrology, Zeus is known, or Jupiter is known to be a benefic and very positive. It's expansive and it connects to joyous times and expansion of finances or joy or whatever it may be. So it is interesting that Zeus rules over an Iron Age. And Saturn is now not the ruler of a golden age. In fact, he is quite the opposite. He is in Tartary or Tartarus or Hades, in the far reaches of the underworld. And astrologically, we connect Saturn with difficulties, restrictions, limitations, structures, and death. He is like connected with with the underworld, meaning death. And so it has different and opposite meaning to what we understand astrologically. If we go back to Sumerian times and we look at the characters who represent Saturn and Jupiter, they are Enki and Enlil. And so Enlil is Jupiter and Enki is Saturn. And in those times, Saturn is also a very positive character because he is the one who warns humanity about the flood. Enlil is the one who wants the humans dead and they're bothersome, and just send a flood and get rid of them. So we have a very opposite understanding and energy of the Saturn and Jupiter characters. So what exactly happens? What happens to change this energy? And there might actually be a hint in the Greek story because we have 12 Olympians and then we have 12 Titans. And those 12 rule, perhaps, the signs of the zodiac. One of my favorite YouTube channels is Useful Charts. And Useful Charts has a wonderful video on the Greek mythology family tree. And he goes through the 3 generations of gods, from the primordial to the Titans to the Olympians. And you will see there that the Titans have 12 gods and the Olympians have 12 gods. So let's get into Saturn and Jupiter and their battle and how that might play out in the astrology to help us understand the turning of the ages. Okay, so there's a very important astrological cycle in astrology, which is the Saturn and Jupiter conjunctions. Saturn and Jupiter conjunct every 20 years. And they have a very well understood cycle. The Saturn and Jupiter conjunctions are always associated with sociological changes, with economic changes, and they happen and occur in 200-year cycles. So for 200 years, they cycle in a triplicity through one particular element in the zodiac. So right now, we just entered into triplicity of occurrences in Jupiter, of Saturn and Jupiter conjunctions that will occur for 200 years in air signs. For the next 200 years, they will cycle through the triplicity connected to air signs. So Libra, Aquarius, Gemini, and completely cover all of the points in the zodiac as they precess, and they precess backwards through those signs before entering a new sign again, a new element again. And so for 200 years, they are in air, earth, fire, and water. And the entire cycle takes approximately 800 years to go through. Now, astronomically, there is a very interesting phenomenon that riddled the astrological community called the Great Inequality. And the Great Inequality was something that was really studied and was, many of the greats tried to understand it around the Middle Ages, and they continue to try to understand it even as recently as 2023. There was an article with some mathematics trying to explain this phenomenon. But the phenomenon has been looked at through the eyes of the heliocentric model, and it has failed to explain it. However, the Tychos nicely explains the Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions and the inequality that happens. So the Great Inequality is basically that for part of the cycle, Saturn will be faster than Jupiter as it goes through the cycle, precesses backwards, and the opposite will happen. Jupiter will seem faster. So initially in the Great Inequality, they thought, oh my God, Saturn is moving faster than Jupiter. Saturn is going to fly off into the great unknown, and Jupiter is going to crash into our sun. Then they realized that for part of the cycle, Saturn is faster than Jupiter. And then in the next part of the cycle, Jupiter is faster than Saturn. And so during this 800-year period, they switch roles. One goes faster than the other, and vice versa. And in the end, they equal out. And so nobody crashes into anything, nobody flies off into space. The whole cycle repeats over and over and over, and the two of them have this back and forth relationship. They cannot explain this in the heliocentric model. However, Simon Jack has explained it using the Tychos model, and it all has to do with perspective. Our perspective from Earth is that when it's in the upper quadrant or in the upper hemisphere, that Saturn will appear to be faster than Jupiter. And quite the opposite when it's in the lower or the southern hemisphere. Saturn will be faster and Jupiter will be slower. I hope I said that right. Anyways, it's opposite. Well, if we look at the Tychos model, in the Tychos model, Earth's orbit, we're currently in Gemini, so we're pointed in the northern hemisphere. So that is pointing us at Polaris, and we're kind of, coming up out of the bottom into the southern hemisphere. So it's quite opposite in the zodiacal scheme of things, where we see Aries to Libra on the bottom. However, this is the northern hemisphere. And then on the top, we see from Virgo to Pisces, which is correspondent with the southern hemisphere. And so when Earth is in the southern hemisphere now, it's in a different perspective. And so 12,000 years from now, when it's on the opposite side of its cycle, it will be looking at Saturn and Jupiter from a different perspective. And what that means is that the perspective will flip again, so that whatever's in the bottom hemisphere will look different than what is in the southern hemisphere. So this means that as Earth is cycling through our orbit, that Saturn and Jupiter will give us some information about where we are in our cycle. And will also give us some information about when that cycle is about to change. There is something in Babylonian astrology, called the Three Paths. And the Three Paths were the path of Enlil, which is the northern hemisphere, the path of Enki, which is the southern hemisphere, and the path of Anu, which is the zodiacal band. It is connected to Earth or the sky or this area. So it would correspond with Uranus. And so when we have Saturn and Jupiter conjunctions, where there's a predominance of conjunctions in one particular hemisphere over the other, we can identify who is the ruler, who is king. So, for instance, when we are in a 800-year cycle of fire, Saturn and Jupiter dominate within the northern hemisphere. And when we have Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions in air signs, Saturn and Jupiter conjunctions dominate in the southern hemisphere. And so for fire, the ruler would be Enlil, and for air, the ruler would be Enki. So I'm hypothesizing that this is also what happens when Earth goes through the entire zodiac. And so when Earth is traveling through the area of its orbit that coincides with the southern hemisphere, it is in the area of Enki and is ruled by Enki. And when the Earth is in the northern hemisphere, it is ruled by Enlil, and it is in the stars, moving through the stars that Enlil governs over. And how we can determine that is by looking at where Earth is pointing. And so we know right now that Earth is pointing at Polaris, and Polaris is in the Gemini band of the zodiac. So here we return to the myth. Saturn rules the Golden Age, and when Earth travels through the southern Enki sector, Saturn is king, and Jupiter rules the descending Iron Age. And when Earth travels through the northern Enlil sector, Jupiter is king. And I'm also hypothesizing that the energy that these planets take on when they are in sectors of the sky that they aren't ruler over becomes different. So when Jupiter is king, Saturn is malefic. And when Saturn becomes king, Jupiter becomes malefic. And we can also look at this as all of the other planets having a different expression as well when Jupiter or Saturn are king of the age. So, for instance, we know that the sun has been referred to sometimes as feminine, and right now we know it as masculine. But perhaps when we go into a golden age, or when we return to a time of peace where Saturn is ruling, then the sun becomes more feminine again. And it is called
Ceres, or it is called Amaterasu, or it has other names for it that signify that it is more feminine. So another poorly misunderstood concept in ancient Sumerian and Babylonian texts is the idea of Nibiru. And so many people know Nibiru because it is often named as the ninth planet, or the planet that we don't see, but that when it comes into our orbit will signify a time of disaster or whatever it may be. And this has come from Zachariah Stitchin and his writings on Nibiru. But the text and the meaning, so Nibiru means crossing or point of transition. And it appears in the Enuma Elish and the Mul Alpin, and the texts associate it with a couple of different planets. And so by virtue of that, we can identify it not as a planet, but perhaps as a condition of a planet. So it says in one of the tablets, if Mercury divides the sky and stands there, its name is Nibiru. And this links it to Mercury when it's bisecting the sky. And so this is telling us that it's Mercury retrograde, because when Mercury retrogrades and is on the ecliptic, it kind of stands still. It doesn't. It stands still, and it looks like it's a snake rather than a retrograde loop. So this is likely what Nibiru means, and Nibiru has also been referred to by the planet Jupiter. So then what we can see is that planets also traveling in these areas of the sky have an expression of Enlil or Enki as they move in southern or northern declination. So Gary Caton has actually done some work, and he has identified that, in fact, planets in their retrograde cycles have different retrograde loops. And these different retrograde loops look like they're going forward or like they're going backward, or they look like snakes going up or snakes going down. And this is what he says determines the energy and the difference between one retrograde cycle and another. We can also connect it to when a planet is in the northern hemisphere or the southern hemisphere, or in Nibiru, which is the crossing. We also have another great book that was put together by Rosie Finn, and Rosie Finn's book, Persephone's Revolution, Pluto's Path to the End of the Empire. She speaks specifically about Pluto being in southern declination or northern declination, and has done a lot of research to identify that actually when Pluto is in the northern declination, it's pretty nasty. And when it is in southern declination, it is far more for the people. And so here we have this distinction showing up again. In the northern declination, it would be Enlil, and in southern declination, it would be Enki, who is for the people. So one more thing that I want to mention, because it seems as though it's always Enki or Enlil that is the ruler, but we do have Anu, which represents that ecliptic range, which I'm also linking with Nibiru. And it is a short period of time. And so Anu rules this ecliptic range. And the reason it's a short period of time is in the Great Cycle, the periods of time speed up towards the end, and they slow down within the cycle. And so the reason that they speed up is because they are moving towards the end, and then they switch directions. They go in another direction. They, instead of precessing, they process. And so this is like turning a corner. You kind of have to slow down to get around the corner. And then you move, even though you might be continuing in one direction, as you move around, let's say a mountain, and you start to go a different direction, even though you're moving forward, if that makes sense. So Anu, I suspect, is the times that are very short, but are linked to Anu because Anu is the primordial god, that it could be very just those 12,000 years cyclical, destructive phases of time where we have fire and then we have flood.
So I want to thank you so much for joining me. I would love to hear your comments or your feedback, or your ideas about possible explanations or possibly expanding on some of these thoughts. I would love to hear from you. Please subscribe and follow me for more about the Tychos as I journey through the mythology and the ancient interpretations of astrology to piece together the meaning of the zodiac. And if you haven't already figured out, I do believe that the Tychos, even though it was recently put together by Simon Schach, was known in ancient times. And so this is the very significant thing about the work that I'm doing, that it pieces together what we now know with what was possibly forgotten long ago. All right, take care. We'll see you soon.